I knew I was no longer part of my own family the moment my son raised his glass and thanked everyone but me. The ballroom at the Lakeshore Country Club was glowing in soft ivory light, crystal chandeliers reflecting off polished floors, white roses arranged perfectly down a 30-foot reception table I had paid for myself. At 67, I never imagined I would be walking down an aisle again, but after 10 years of widowhood, I had finally allowed myself to believe in love a second time. Thomas stood beside me that afternoon, steady and kind, his silver hair neatly combed, his navy suit tailored just enough to make him look proud without trying too hard. I remember adjusting the lace at my sleeve while the guests settled into their seats, the string quartet playing something gentle and familiar. I had sent invitations to everyone 3 months earlier, including my son Daniel and his wife Ashley. I told myself that no matter how distant we had grown, a wedding would soften things. Weddings do that, don't they? They remind families that love still exists. When Daniel arrived, he hugged Thomas politely, but gave me only a quick, careful smile. Ashley wore a pale champagne dress that almost matched mine, though I told myself that was just coincidence. I chose not to notice the way she scanned the room as if evaluating it, as if measuring the success of something she hadn't planned. During the ceremony, I focused on Thomas's hands, warm around mine, on the minister's steady voice, on the promise that it was never too late to begin again. For a few brief minutes, I allowed myself to feel safe. The applause was warm when we were pronounced husband and wife, and cameras flashed while I smiled so wide my cheeks ached. I truly believed that if I looked happy enough, everyone else would feel it too. At the reception, Daniel offered to make a toast. My heart swelled when he stood, tall and confident at 42, holding a glass of champagne. I thought perhaps this would be the moment everything shifted back into place. He cleared his throat and thanked Thomas for being a solid man. He thanked Ashley for always holding our family together. He even thanked his father's memory for shaping who he had become. The guests nodded, some dabbing at their eyes. I waited. I kept smiling. Surely he would turn toward me. Surely he would say something about the woman who raised him, who worked double shifts to help pay for his college tuition, who hosted every Thanksgiving for 3 decades. But he didn't. He lifted his glass and said, "To real family." Real family. The words floated through the room so softly that no one else seemed to notice the weight of them. Applause followed, bright and polite. I felt Thomas squeeze my hand under the table, subtle but firm. I did not react. I did not frown. I did not let my shoulders fall. Instead, I lifted my own glass and smiled as though nothing had been erased. Ashley caught my eye from across the table, her lips curved in something that almost resembled sympathy, but didn't quite reach her eyes. In that instant, I understood something I had refused to admit for years. This wasn't about my remarriage. It wasn't about timing or tradition. It was about acceptance I had never truly been given. I had been tolerated, managed, positioned at the edge of photographs. And now, on the day that was meant to celebrate my new beginning, I realized I had been quietly written out of the old one. The music resumed, guests rose to mingle, and the photographer called for a family picture. I stood where I was told, slightly to the side, watching as Daniel placed Ashley at the center of the frame. I kept smiling. After all, it was my wedding day, and I had just learned exactly where I stood. The photographer's assistant adjusted the lighting while guests shifted around us, heels clicking softly against the polished floor, and I watched as Daniel leaned toward Ashley, whispering something that made her smile in that careful, composed way she had perfected over the years. Thomas remained beside me, his hand resting lightly at the small of my back, steady and reassuring, yet I could feel the subtle tension in him, the quiet awareness that something had just unfolded in front of everyone without truly being seen. When the photographer asked for immediate family to step closer, there was a brief hesitation, just long enough for me to notice that no one looked directly at me for instruction. Daniel moved first, guiding Ashley forward, and then he gestured toward Thomas with polite courtesy, as if Thomas were a distant guest rather than the groom. I waited to be drawn in, to be centered, to be acknowledged as the bridge between all of them. Instead, I was positioned near the edge of the frame, close enough to be visible, but far enough to feel optional. I folded my hands neatly in front of me, lifting my chin slightly, so that no one would see the shift in my expression. The flash went off several times. I wondered how the photograph would look when printed and framed. I wondered if I would appear like part of the story or simply part of the background. As the music transitioned into something livelier, and servers began circulating with trays of sparkling cider and champagne, I excused myself from the cluster of guests and stepped toward the window overlooking the golf course. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm amber glow over the rolling green hills, and for a moment I allowed myself to breathe deeply, steadying my thoughts. Thomas joined me a few seconds later, not speaking immediately, just standing close enough so that I would not feel alone. He did not ask what was wrong. He did not need to. I had spent so many years convincing myself that small moments did not matter, that I was imagining the distance, that I was overly sensitive. I told myself that Ashley was simply protective, that Daniel was simply busy building his own life, that modern families functioned differently than the ones I grew up in. Yet standing there in my wedding gown, watching guests laugh and toast at tables I had carefully arranged weeks in advance, I could no longer pretend that this was new. The omission in the speech was not a mistake. It was a pattern. I remembered Christmas 3 years earlier when Daniel insisted they celebrate at Ashley's parents' home and forgot to tell me until 2 days before. I remembered the hospital visit when I had sprained my ankle and Daniel sent flowers, but did not come in person, explaining that work was overwhelming. I remembered birthdays where I mailed thoughtful gifts and received brief thank you messages typed, without punctuation or warmth. Each memory had been easy to excuse on its own. Together, they formed something undeniable. Thomas finally spoke in a calm, measured tone and said that he was proud of me, not just for today, but for enduring more than anyone realized. His words were simple, yet they settled into me like something solid and real. I nodded and thanked him, refusing to let tears form because this was not a day for tears. This was a day for clarity. When Daniel approached us again, asking if we would join the dance floor for the first song, his voice was light and casual. He did not seem aware that anything had shifted. I smiled and agreed, stepping forward with composure, but inside I understood that acceptance is not something granted by ceremony or by title. It is revealed in small, quiet choices. And in that ballroom, surrounded by music and polite applause, I recognized that I had been standing outside the circle long before this evening ever began. The first dance began with a slow melody that filled the ballroom, something soft and familiar that might have once made me sentimental, but tonight it felt like background music to a realization I could no longer ignore. Thomas extended his hand, and I placed mine in his, allowing him to guide me toward the center of the floor while guests formed a loose circle around us. The hem of my gown brushed lightly against the polished wood, and I kept my posture straight, my expression warm, because dignity is something you protect even when your heart is unsettled. I noticed Daniel standing a few feet away with Ashley, her hand resting comfortably on his arm as if she had always belonged there, as if the space beside him had been reserved long before I ever entered the room. When the photographer called for a mother and son picture after the first song, Daniel hesitated just long enough for me to see him glance toward Ashley, seeking some silent confirmation. It was subtle. Most people would not have noticed. But I did. I have always noticed the pauses. We stood together for the photograph, his arm loosely around my shoulder, his smile polite and composed. He smelled faintly of the cologne I used to buy him every Christmas when he was in college. For a brief second, I remembered the little boy who used to hold my hand crossing busy streets, who once told me I was the strongest woman he knew. The flash went off. He stepped away quickly, returning to Ashley's side as if drawn back by gravity. I remained in place for a moment longer, feeling the absence more than the presence. During dinner, I watched the room from behind a glass of sparkling water, observing the easy conversations at each table. Ashley laughed freely with her parents, her voice carrying lightly across the room, confident and assured. Daniel leaned toward her as she spoke, nodding, attentive. When I attempted to join their conversation about an upcoming vacation they were planning, the details shifted quickly, becoming vague and general, as though the specifics were not meant for me. I asked simple questions. They answered briefly. It was not hostility. It was distance. The kind of distance that is built carefully over years through small exclusions that are easy to dismiss individually but impossible to ignore collectively. Thomas noticed it too. He asked Daniel about his work, drawing him into neutral territory, trying gently to bridge the space. Daniel responded with enthusiasm then, animated and relaxed. I studied his face, searching for resentment or embarrassment, trying to understand what had changed between us. I did not see cruelty. I saw something quieter, a quiet reshaping of loyalty. As the evening moved forward and the band shifted into livelier songs, guests began to dance in groups, laughter rising with the tempo. I excused myself briefly and walked toward the hallway leading to the restrooms, needing a few minutes of stillness. In the mirror, I saw a woman who looked composed, elegant, steady. No tears, no anger, just clarity. I realized that acceptance is rarely withdrawn in a dramatic gesture. It fades gradually, replaced by new allegiances and unspoken priorities. I had not been pushed out with force. I had simply been moved aside. Standing there beneath the soft overhead lights, I understood that tonight was not about humiliation. It was about awakening. An awakening, even when it arrives quietly, changes everything. When I returned to the ballroom, nothing outwardly had changed. The music continued, plates were cleared, laughter rose and fell in waves across the room, and the cake stood tall at the center table, perfectly frosted in ivory buttercream. Yet something inside me had shifted into a calm I had not known before. I moved through the crowd slowly, pausing to thank guests for coming, listening to compliments about the ceremony, about my dress, about how lovely Thomas and I looked together. I responded graciously, because grace had always been my language. But beneath every polite exchange, I was tracing the pattern of the past decade with a clarity that felt almost mathematical. I remembered the afternoon I told Daniel that Thomas and I had begun seeing each other. We were sitting at my kitchen table, the same oak table where Daniel had done his homework as a boy. Sunlight streamed through the window, landing on the bowl of apples I kept at the center. Daniel's smile had been thin that day. He said he was happy for me. He said I deserved companionship. But his eyes had shifted briefly toward Ashley, who sat beside him stirring her coffee without drinking it. She asked how serious it was. She asked whether Thomas had children. She asked whether I planned to sell the house. At the time, I thought those were practical questions. Now I understood that they were measurements. Measurements of how much space my new life would occupy in theirs. After that conversation, small changes followed. Sunday dinners became less frequent. Invitations arrived later, sometimes only hours before events. Conversations about finances grew cautious, even though I had never once asked Daniel for assistance. I had worked as a school administrator for 30 years. I managed my savings carefully. I paid for this wedding myself, including the deposit for the venue and the catering for 120 guests. I did not do it to prove anything. I did it because I believed independence was a gift I could offer my son. I see now that independence can sometimes be misinterpreted as distance. As the evening progressed, Thomas and I cut the cake together, smiling for photographs, feeding each other small, careful bites while guests applauded lightly. Daniel stood near the front with Ashley, clapping politely. There was no open conflict, no raised voices, just a quiet rearranging of priorities that placed me slightly outside the center of his life. I thought back to the year after his father passed away, when Daniel called me every evening for weeks, asking how I was sleeping, whether I had eaten dinner, whether I needed anything. Ashley had not yet entered the picture then. His concern had been unfiltered, direct. I do not blame her for loving him. That is what spouses do. They build their own circle. But somewhere along the way, my place within that circle narrowed without discussion. I took my seat again beside Thomas as the band played another slow song, and I realized that tonight was not an ending. It was confirmation. Confirmation that acceptance cannot be demanded or negotiated. It either exists or it does not. I had spent years adjusting myself to fit within the margins of someone else's comfort. Standing in that ballroom, surrounded by crystal glassware and white linen, I felt something unexpected settle over me. Not resentment, not sorrow, resolution. I could not control how Daniel defined family, but I could decide how I defined myself within it. The evening continued with the kind of steady rhythm that allows everyone to believe everything is perfectly in place. Coffee was served in delicate white cups, small silver spoons resting neatly against saucers, and conversations softened into comfortable tones as the night deepened. I sat beside Thomas, watching candlelight flicker across the centerpieces I had chosen weeks ago, tall arrangements of white roses and eucalyptus that were meant to symbolize renewal. Renewal. I found the word almost ironic now. Daniel approached our table with Ashley close behind him, her hand lightly resting on his arm as though she were guiding him without appearing to do so. He asked if I was enjoying myself. The question sounded polite, practiced. I told him I was. And in a way, that was true. Enjoyment does not always mean happiness. Sometimes it means awareness. Ashley complimented the venue, mentioning how elegant everything looked, how generous it was of me to host such a large celebration. Her tone carried a subtle emphasis on generous. I nodded and thanked her, noticing how carefully she avoided addressing Thomas directly. It was not hostility. It was exclusion by omission. Daniel then mentioned that they would likely leave soon because they had an early morning the next day. The words landed gently, yet they revealed something larger. Weddings usually stretch late into the night, especially when they belong to someone you claim as family. I smiled and told him I understood. Responsibilities never pause. He hesitated for a moment, as though considering whether to add something more, perhaps an acknowledgement of the years behind us, perhaps a recognition of the effort poured into this day. Instead, he simply said that he hoped Thomas and I would be happy. The sentence felt carefully constructed. Thomas responded, with warmth, thanking him sincerely, bridging the gap that Daniel seemed unwilling to cross. When they walked away, I watched them move through the crowd together, seamless, unified. It struck me then that their unity was not the problem. The problem was my expectation that there would still be space for me within it. I remembered the first time Ashley hosted Thanksgiving at her home. She arranged the table beautifully, assigned seats deliberately, and placed me at the far end, explaining that it was closer to the kitchen and more convenient for serving. I had accepted that reasoning without question. I have always accepted reasonable explanations. Yet patterns do not announce themselves loudly. They accumulate quietly. Tonight was simply the clearest example. As guests began collecting coats and offering final congratulations, I stood near the entrance with Thomas, thanking each person personally. When Daniel and Ashley reached us, Daniel embraced me lightly. His hug was brief, his posture already angled toward the exit. Ashley kissed the air near my cheek and wished us a wonderful honeymoon. I told them to drive safely. I meant it. There was no bitterness in my voice, only calm. As the doors closed behind them and the room gradually emptied, I felt neither anger nor grief. I felt alignment. Alignment between what I had sensed for years and what I could now plainly see. Thomas took my hand again, and we stood together in the quieting ballroom, surrounded by half-burned candles and empty glasses. I realized that acceptance does not come from being included in photographs or mentioned in speeches. It comes from being valued without hesitation. And tonight, in the most graceful way possible, I had been shown exactly where I stood. After the last guest left and the staff began clearing the tables, Thomas and I walked slowly through the ballroom one final time. The chairs were being stacked, the roses carefully lifted from their vases, and the soft glow that had made everything feel magical only hours earlier was fading into something practical and ordinary. I slipped off my heels and carried them in one hand, feeling the cool marble floor beneath my feet. It grounded me. Thomas asked if I was tired. I told him I was thoughtful. There is a difference. We gathered our things quietly, thanked the event coordinator, and stepped outside into the crisp evening air. The parking lot was nearly empty. A faint breeze moved through the trees lining the edge of the golf course, and for the first time all day, there was silence. True silence. I stood there for a moment, looking back at the building where I had begun a new chapter only a few hours earlier. It occurred to me that weddings are often described as beginnings, but sometimes they are revelations. On the drive home, Thomas kept one hand lightly resting over mine on the center console. He did not fill the quiet with unnecessary reassurance. He simply remained present. I watched the streetlights pass in steady intervals, thinking about how many times I had adjusted myself over the years to maintain harmony. I thought about the birthday dinners I moved to accommodate Ashley's schedule, the holiday traditions I quietly set aside because they were described as outdated, the careful way I avoided offering opinions that might be interpreted as interference. None of those adjustments were dramatic. Each one felt reasonable in isolation. But taken together, they formed a slow retreat from my own center. When we arrived home, I hung my gown carefully in the guest room closet, smoothing the fabric with deliberate hands. It had been a beautiful dress. The evening had been beautiful too, in its own way. I sat at the edge of the bed and removed my earrings, placing them neatly in their velvet box. Thomas leaned against the doorway and asked gently if I regretted anything. I considered the question fully before answering. I did not regret marrying him. I did not regret celebrating love at my age. What I regretted was waiting so long to see what had been clear for years. Daniel had built a life that revolved around his own household. That is natural. That is what adults do. But somewhere in that transition, my role shifted from foundation to accessory. I had mistaken politeness for closeness. I had mistaken inclusion in events for inclusion in loyalty. The difference is subtle but powerful. Later that night, as I washed my face and looked into the bathroom mirror, I noticed how calm I appeared. There were no signs of distress, no trembling hands, only steadiness. I realized that clarity does not require confrontation. It requires acceptance. I cannot force my place in someone else's priorities. I can only decide how much access I grant to my own. As I turned off the light and walked toward the bedroom where Thomas was already waiting, I felt something settle inside me with quiet certainty. The evening had given me more than a marriage. It had given me understanding. And understanding, once fully embraced, changes the way you move forward. The morning after the wedding arrived quietly, sunlight filtering through the kitchen windows in soft, golden lines that stretched across the hardwood floor. I woke before Thomas, as I usually do, and made coffee in the same ceramic pot I have used for years. The house felt peaceful, almost ceremonious in its stillness. I stood at the counter waiting for the coffee to finish brewing, listening to the steady drip, and allowed my thoughts to settle without resistance. There was no lingering ache from the night before, only awareness. I carried 2 mugs to the small breakfast table and opened the curtains wider, letting the early autumn air slip through the screen. When Thomas joined me, he did not ask how I felt. Instead, he asked what I wanted this next chapter to look like. It was such a simple question, yet no one had asked me that in a very long time. For years, my decisions had been framed around how they would affect Daniel, how they would be interpreted by Ashley, how they might maintain balance within a family that had slowly redefined its center. I realized that I had been operating as though acceptance were something I needed to preserve, even when it was conditional. I sipped my coffee and considered Thomas's question carefully. I told him I wanted clarity in my relationships. I wanted honesty without tension. I wanted to give without feeling as though my presence required negotiation. He listened without interruption, his expression steady and supportive. Later that morning, my phone buzzed with a message from Daniel. It was brief. He thanked me for a lovely evening and said they arrived home safely. There was no mention of the toast, no acknowledgement of anything unsaid. I stared at the screen for a moment before responding with equal simplicity. I was glad they made it home safely. I hoped they rested well. I did not add more. I did not reach for reassurance. The exchange felt balanced for the first time. Not intimate, not strained, simply balanced. As the day unfolded, I began tidying the house, placing wedding cards neatly into a wooden box, stacking gifts on the dining room sideboard. Each card contained kind words from friends who had known me for decades, people who had witnessed my life in its fullness. Their messages reminded me that acceptance does exist, just not always where we expect it. In the afternoon, I stepped onto the back patio with a notebook and began outlining practical matters I had postponed for years. Estate planning, financial distributions, not out of spite, but out of responsibility. I wanted my affairs to reflect my clarity. I had always intended to divide everything equally. That intention came from love. Now I understood that love also requires boundaries. Boundaries are not punishments. They are definitions. I wrote calmly, methodically, knowing I would speak with my attorney in the coming weeks. As the sun lowered in the sky and the air cooled, Thomas joined me outside, wrapping a light shawl around my shoulders without a word. I leaned back in the chair and watched the trees sway gently beyond the fence. I felt something solid inside me, something no longer dependent on external validation. Daniel may never fully understand what shifted last night. He may never see the omission as meaningful. But I saw it, and seeing it was enough. Acceptance from others is a gift when it is freely given. Self-acceptance, however, is a decision. And that morning, with a quiet house and a clear mind, I chose it without hesitation. 3 days after the wedding, I sat across from my attorney in a quiet office overlooking the river downtown. The building was modest, brick on the outside, with a narrow hallway lined with framed certificates and photographs of civic award dinners from years past. I had worked with Mr. Halpern for nearly 2 decades. He handled the estate when my first husband passed away, and he understood my preference for clarity over drama. I placed my leather folder on his desk and explained that I wanted to review everything. Not because of conflict, not because of anger, because of alignment. He listened carefully, hands folded, asking measured questions about my intentions. I told him that I wanted my assets distributed in a way that reflected presence and consistency, not just biology. I explained that Thomas and I would be creating shared accounts and adjusting property titles. I also explained that I intended to establish a charitable scholarship fund at the high school where I worked for so many years. Education had been my life's work. It felt right to extend that legacy beyond family lines. Mr. Halpern nodded and began outlining the legal steps, his tone steady and professional. There was nothing emotional about the process. It was paperwork, signatures, percentages. But to me, it felt like reclaiming authorship of my own story. That afternoon, Daniel called unexpectedly. His voice carried a hint of curiosity as he asked how Thomas and I were settling in. I answered honestly. We were well. We were organizing the house. We were planning a short trip to Vermont in the fall to see the leaves change color. He paused, then asked whether I needed help with anything financial now that I was married again. The question was framed as concern, yet it carried an undertone I recognized. I thanked him for the offer and assured him that everything was handled. I did not elaborate. I did not volunteer details about the meeting earlier that day. Boundaries do not require announcements. They require consistency. Over the following week, I noticed a subtle shift in myself. I stopped initiating daily messages. I responded when contacted, warmly but briefly. I redirected conversations that felt transactional. When Ashley texted asking whether Thomas and I would be contributing to a joint vacation rental the following summer, I replied that we had already made other plans. That was true. Thomas and I had decided to spend next summer traveling through small coastal towns along the Carolinas, staying in bed and breakfasts, waking up to the sound of the ocean instead of group itineraries. The response was polite. Final. There was no apology in it. One evening, as I filed copies of updated documents into my home office cabinet, I felt a quiet satisfaction settle over me. Not because anyone had been excluded, but because I had finally included myself in the equation. For years, I measured my decisions by how they would be received. Now I measured them by whether they felt honest. Thomas noticed the difference. He told me I seemed lighter. I suppose clarity has that effect. It removes the weight of expectation. I still loved my son. That had not changed. Love does not disappear because awareness grows. But love without boundaries often becomes self-erasure. I no longer intended to erase myself for the comfort of others. As the evening sun streamed through the office window and cast long shadows across the hardwood floor, I closed the cabinet gently and turned off the light. The adjustments were complete. The definitions were clear. And for the first time in years, I felt entirely at peace with the space I occupied. Several weeks passed, and life began to settle into a rhythm that felt deliberate rather than reactive. Thomas and I took our planned trip to Vermont in early October, driving along winding 2-lane highways lined with maple trees blazing in shades of red and gold. We stayed in a small inn overlooking a quiet lake, rising early each morning to watch the mist lift from the water. The air was crisp, cool enough to require sweaters, and the simplicity of those mornings felt like a reward for the clarity I had chosen. I found myself thinking less about what had happened at the reception and more about what had followed. Distance, when chosen calmly, does not feel like punishment. It feels like space. Daniel called once during that trip. He asked about the scenery and mentioned that Ashley's parents were hosting a large gathering for the holidays. There was an assumption in his tone that we would attend. I listened carefully before responding. I told him that Thomas and I had decided to spend the holidays quietly this year, perhaps inviting a few close friends for dinner instead. There was a pause on the line. Not anger, not confrontation, just surprise. He said he understood. I believed that he did, at least partially. After we returned home, I framed one of the wedding photographs and placed it on the bookshelf in the living room. In the image, Thomas and I stood together, smiling naturally, the sunset filtering through the tall windows behind us. Daniel and Ashley were visible in the background, slightly out of focus. I did not crop them out. I did not hide the picture away. I kept it exactly as it was, because that photograph represented truth. It showed where everyone stood, without exaggeration or resentment. One afternoon, Daniel stopped by unexpectedly. He had been in the area and decided to visit. I invited him in, offered coffee, and sat with him at the kitchen table. He looked around the house as though noticing subtle changes, the rearranged furniture, the fresh flowers Thomas had brought home that morning. After a few minutes of casual conversation, he asked quietly whether everything was all right between us. The question was careful. I answered carefully. I told him that everything was clear. I explained that I loved him deeply, but that I no longer intended to interpret silence as connection. I said that if he wished to be present in my life, I would welcome it. But presence required intention, not obligation. He listened without interrupting. For the first time in years, the conversation felt honest rather than polite. When he left, he hugged me longer than usual. I did not measure the hug. I simply accepted it. That evening, as I stood beside Thomas watching the sun lower behind the trees in our backyard, I felt a steadiness that did not depend on anyone else's approval. I had entered marriage again believing I needed to be embraced by every branch of my family tree. Instead, I discovered that roots matter more than branches. Roots are internal. They are built from self-respect and clarity. Whether Daniel chooses to grow closer or remain at a distance is now his decision. Mine has already been made. I no longer seek to be fully accepted in spaces that require me to shrink. I stand where I belong, calmly, without apology. And that has made all the difference.